my pleasure to introduce Dr. Martha Farah. Dr. Farah began her academic career at MIT, where she received bachelor degrees in philosophy and metallurgy and material science, which is one of the more interesting degree combinations that I think I've ever seen. She then continued her education at Harvard University, where she received a PhD in psychology. I believe that she then stuck around in Boston for a couple years before starting a faculty position at Carnegie Mellon University, where she very hastily rose through the ranks from assistant professor to associate professor to full professor before moving to Penn in 1992, I believe.
Yeah.
In that time, she has had what could be called multiple independent distinguished careers. Her earliest work answered foundational questions about vision, memory, and object recognition, and in many respects paved the way for the decades of work in cognitive neuroscience that have followed. But in the last 20 years, Dr. Farah has focused on ambitious projects in neuroethics, studying, for instance, how socioeconomic status influences the brain and its development, and how we should approach neurocognitive enhancement. It is customary in these introductions to really aggrandize our guest, but in this case it's actually...
You're doing a pretty good job. I'm embarrassed.
In this case it's actually really hard to overstate the impact of Dr. Farah's career and just the monumental impact that it's had on vision and cognitive neuroscience. It goes without saying that her career has been marked by countless awards and achievement, which we do not have time to cover here. I'll just end with one fun fact that Dr. Farah herself does not know, which is that her textbook, The Cognitive Neuroscience of Vision, is the first textbook that I read when I was learning about vision science 10 years ago.
Nice.
This is my original copy with notes and questions and actually poems I wrote in the margins while I was daydreaming in class. So this is actually really important to me, and I've kept it. It's one of the 6 books that I've kept for all these years.
Oh,
so it's very important to me.
Good.
The reason I mention this is because I think that there are many ways to measure impact in one's career. You have number of publications, the quality of the journals, the citations, and so on. But I think an underappreciated and harder to measure part of one's impact is the impact they have on the future generation of scientists. And I think the fact that I'm here at all conducting this interview is a testament to the impact that Dr. Farah has had on the field at large, because this book was genuinely a major inflection point in my career and my life. So for that reason, it is my honor to introduce Dr. Martha Farah.
Sammy, thank you so much. That I will think back on this at moments of depression and what have I done with my damn...
Yes, I know there are many of those.
Yes,
I thought there
are.
were fewer later in an academic career, but
you never get past it. Anyway, okay, it's a pleasure to be here and to meet with you all, and I'm sorry we won't have time for you to tell me about what you're doing, but maybe in the future. You were going to feed me a few questions.
Yeah, I was just going to start with the most simple question. I started your bio there at college, but do you want to tell us a little bit about before college, where you grew up, what your parents did? What did you want to be when you grew up?
Oh, well, for a long time I wanted to be an astronomer. When I was a really little girl, 9, 10, I used to write my name in my books, Martha Farah, future astronomer. And, I lived at the planetarium. I grew up in New York. The Hayden Planetarium, which they tore down, the new one, with Neil deGrasse Tyson as the, resident star. A totally different look. The old one was a nice, fusty old, Museum of Natural History, built turn of the century, I guess. I don't know. Anyway, I always wanted to be a scientist. It was partly an act of rebellion against my parents, who were artsy types. My father was an aspiring playwright. Didn't have much success. But my mother basically was an aspiring actress. She came to New York to, make it on Broadway, and of course did not, as 99% of the people who start that way do. But, you know, neither of them knew anything about science. I mean, I think, you know, if they're dead now, but, you know, if you would ask them, like, do you know what an atom is? Like, they would go, I don't know. My father may or may not have graduated high school. We do not know. He claims he did. My mother always expressed skepticism. My mother went to college. It was a kind of small religious school. I don't think it was a very rigorous program in the Midwest. So, yeah, and basically science was kind of not of interest to them. And I embraced it because my parents had sort of the artistic temperament, right? They would be, you know, really in favor of something or really against it. And it always seemed that there was like no data involved. And I loved the idea of, you know, a career, a way of life, where you get the relevant data and you analyze it in rational, you know, in a rational way, perhaps in rational discussion with others, and then you figure out what's what and what you should do. And that was very different from my folks. So yeah, I mean, whatever else I knew I was going to be when I grew up, I knew, you know, was definitely a scientist. I went to MIT for college, ended up, well, you know, I was gonna be a chemistry major. First term I took organic chemistry. I was like, oh, no thank you. You know, it's like pushing bonds around on a piece of paper. It seemed totally divorced from anything, plus it was full of pre-meds. So I kind of looked around. I stumbled into a metallurgy class and I liked it. And you know, there's a lot of chemistry in it's got a lot of the same attractions. And then I meandered around a little more and found psychology. Yeah, so I'll stop there.
How did that meandering into psychology kind of skips an important step maybe? How did that transformation happen? What did that look like? Was it just like you suddenly fell in love, you discovered this new thing, or was there sort of a trajectory to find yourself there?
Yeah, fair question. Well, I mean, I have to say, I liked metallurgy and material science. So I wasn't like trying to escape something I didn't like. It was just, I sort of found something I liked a bit more. And there was no psychology major at MIT in those days. Now they have brain and cognitive science, but nothing. So philosophy seemed kind of same kind of thing-ish. But I remember I took, in my junior year, I think it was, I took a history of physics course. And I felt so jealous of these giant figures, you know, in the 17th century, trying to like figure out basic stuff, like sort of not only, you know, sort of how does the world work, but what is even the relevant kind of data to ask how it works? You know, they were sort of being philosophers and empirical scientists at the same time, because it isn't like there was this really well-established, you know, have you all been forced to read Thomas Kuhn's The Structure of Scientific Revolutions? That used to be like required for everybody. Yeah, so, you know, he talks about, what is it, paradigm science and revolutionary science. And, you know, when you're in a paradigm science, you don't have to think real hard about what you're doing. The framework that you have to work within kind of tells you like what the next experiment ought to be. I'm exaggerating. It's not quite that mindless, but if you're, if you're between paradigms, right, then you've really got to think hard about what the heck are you doing? How should you do it? Why should you do it? And I just thought, ooh, that's yummy. That's intellectually yummy. So I said, I got to find me an immature science, psychology, right? And I mean, I will say, maybe we can come back to this in a bit, but one of the, treats of my career has been seeing the field of psychology mature over, I was in college, I graduated college in the 70s. So, what is that? 50 years, roughly, of scientific development, and things have really changed. It's kind of mind-boggling to think back to what people were arguing about, working on, etc., in those dark ages. So, yeah.
When you first started doing empirical work in psychology, what was the first question or set of questions that gripped you and got you hooked?
Well, I was interested in vision and visual cognition. I started out doing my post-college research assistant year, which I'm sure many of you will end up doing. It was not that common a path in my day, but I think it's become quite common, and I think it's a really good idea. You kind of get an up-close sample of what the field is like. It's just one sample, and it looms large if you're going to that lab every day, so it could conceivably be, not the right information to base decisions on, but anyway, it's a good time. You make a little bit of money. I was working in the lab of Steve Coslin, who at that point was doing research on mental imagery and was in the midst of a big controversy about whether mental images were really sort of analog, what he called quasi-pictorial. He didn't want to say pictorial because then people would say, oh, that's ridiculous, you're so concrete, it's not a picture. So he said quasi-pictorial representations, or whether they were symbolic, propositional representations in the language of thought, which I'm sure you guys have encountered or will encounter soon from Russell. I did the drudge work, but I did, I was in the Harvard psychology department, and I could go to the lunchtime talks, and yeah, it was very interesting. So, and then, I was really quite captivated by that question. So,
I want to ask you in a minute about some of the challenges about those early stages of career, but first we'll start on a positive note. In those undergraduate, graduate years, were there any particular formative moments that changed your trajectory or really inspired you, or people who were especially formative in your development as a scientist?
Such an interesting question. Well, I'll tell you, I remember one professor who I worked for part-time as a research assistant, named Don Uhlman. He was a material scientist, worked, I think he still is working. He left MIT and went somewhere else, I can't remember, out west, I think. He worked on glasses and polymers, and I got to help him out with that. And he made a huge impression on me, even though I didn't go on in that field, because he would be so enthusiastic. Like, I would come into his office, and he would be sitting behind his desk, and I would be sitting in the visitor chair here, and I would tell him something about what I had found, and he would go like that. And it was was beautiful. I mean, it just made me think, wow, you know, this guy has put his heart into this work, and you know, he's got an emotional life, and it encompasses his work, and it was just so nice. It was just so nice. He did, when I asked him for a letter of recommendation for psychology graduate school, he was like, I don't know, are you sure you want to do that? Yeah, so that really stuck with me. And he always smoked these smelly cigars in his office. And to this day, I hate cigarette smoke, you know, but I love cigar smoke. And it's just, you know, smell, the limbic system, memory, you know, I just have this very warm, happy, emotional memory of him. So he was kind of a role model, I would say. I'm trying to think of other people. Isn't that sad? I can't think of anybody else. I'm sure I'm overlooking somebody, but.
And then if you this is kind of skipping ahead a bit, or maybe it isn't, but looking back on the many distinguished careers you've had, is there, what would you say has been the most positive part of your career, or the part that was most exciting for you?
Let's see. Well, first of all, I mean, what Sammy means when he talks about many careers is that I have shifted my focus a couple of times. You know, I started out as a vision nerd, if it's not too, no, I started out focused on vision, and vision is a great topic and continues to be a great topic. It's a topic where you can actually, it's really tractable, and it's really important. So, yeah, awesome. I shifted into, you know, attention, executive function, that kind of thing. That was a more sort of gradual shift. And then I had a total, you know, this was my midlife crisis, right? I didn't buy a sports car. Instead, I shifted my research program entirely to socioeconomic status and its correlates in the brain, and the question of, are the correlates effects of living in different levels of socioeconomic status? Are they something else? Is it possible to talk about that and not be, you know, not start a riot? So those are the careers. The most exciting moment, well, you know, the funny thing is, the moment that I think of as a moment was in graduate school. I had to give a talk, I think, and I was trying to pull together some thinking, some ideas, and I thought I had collected all of these case reports of patients who, after some sort of focal brain damage, had lost some imagery ability. They couldn't generate a mental image anymore, they couldn't manipulate them, whatever. And I thought, well, you know, what if we made a task analysis of that? Task analysis is a buzzword that I don't think anybody uses anymore, but it was something people talked a lot about in my day. So, you know, what do you need to do to be able to generate a mental image? And I had your typical 1970s, 80s box and arrow model. People sometimes call them British boxology, because that was really prominent in British cognitive neuropsychology. And, you know, blah, 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 blah. I sort of did a subtractive design, like, well, they can do these boxes, but they can't do it when you add this box. And I realized there was a strong trend that when people were not able to generate a mental image from memory, like they had the long-term knowledge, they were able to recognize things, but they couldn't bring to mind a mental picture. they almost invariably had a left posterior lesion, left, occipitotemporal, maybe occipital-parietal. It was very hard in those days. People didn't have MRIs. Can you believe it? This was like before people were using MRIs. So anyway, I feel almost like embarrassed, like, my little internal victory moment. But I looked at that and I thought, shit, like nature has spoken to me. Yeah, so that was a really meaningful moment that I still remember. But there is that moment. You guys, I'm sure, have had some version of it and will have versions of it where you just kind of feel like, shit, I have seen something that nobody has seen before, and wow. Conceited, yes, but happy nonetheless. Yeah, productive, conceited.
I think that is indeed the best feeling that a scientist can experience. So now, on that happy note, we'll ask about the other side. I think, for me, thinking about my position when I was an undergraduate, thinking about going to grad school and so on, I think I didn't have a full appreciation for the challenges of this career, and of course there are many. So I want to ask, first, just in general, what you see as the most challenging career stage, maybe in general, or maybe specifically to you as well. Maybe it's the same answer.
Yeah. Honestly, I think every stage has its challenges. Obviously, after you get tenure, you can breathe a lot easier. That said, there's always stresses, many self-imposed, but still, getting grants, keeping your lab going, struggles with the friggin' journal editor who doesn't see the brilliance of what you've done, kind of. But I guess pre-tenure, the run up to tenure, it wasn't that stressful for me. I was at Carnegie Mellon, which was a very, very supportive department. I love Carnegie Mellon. I just couldn't stand Pittsburgh, which is why I left. And I was doing well. I know I was doing well. So, of course, I was, I really wanted to get the final word from, the dean, but it wasn't too horrible. But I know it can be really horrible. It's kind of like academia, honestly. If you're aiming for a tenure position, it's kind of like, all or nothing, right? Like, you're going for that blissful guarantee of lifetime employment, and the freedom to work on what you want to work on, right? But if you don't achieve that, you may be in a tough position. Universities adhere to this up or out rule. I don't know if you know about this, but usually, time from starting your assistant professorship to promotion to a tenured position, usually associate professor tenure, is 6-7 years, sometimes more. Some places have a very long track. But if you don't get tenure at that point, you can't say, well, I'll just stay without tenure. No, you can't. You're either promoted or you're out. Now, this may seem heartless, but it's actually designed to protect young academics. Because, of course, if the university had the option of saying, well, we like the direction you're moving in, but, maybe just stay and work another couple of years and then we'll see. They get to sort of keep you dangling without the investment that they would make in you at tenure, saying, okay, stay here, do your work, and we're making a long-term commitment to you. So yeah, I think that can be very stressful. There's a lot of attention nowadays, and I think MindCore has done some good programs on this, directed towards non-academic careers, using the kinds of things that we learn about here. And I think, from the people I know who work in those kinds of situations, they range from like fantastic, working on interesting problems with smart people and having your judgment respected about like what to work on, to pretty dreary. So, but clearly faculty positions run that gamut too. But anyway, so, I think when people don't get tenure, they often consider maybe just going to industry and laughing all the way to the bank, because you get paid a lot more in industry than you do in university. Yeah, so yeah, my toughest period, I don't know. I mean, I will say it's been more in recent years that, my interest in SES and brain development was met with a certain amount of hostility by journal reviewers, grant reviewers, partly because they thought it was politically incorrect, like talking about poor children and brains is somehow blaming the victim or something, as if there isn't some kind of mechanism behind why poor children don't do as well on IQ tests. We know that. It's, don't shoot the messenger. That's well established. Maybe by understanding how stress and lack of prenatal care and, all the rest impact brain development might help us avoid letting further kids grow up that way. But there was, I felt very frustrated. I felt very sort of shunned is kind of too strong a word, maybe, but I mean, I went to a talk once. Mike Posner had a Festschrift when he retired from University of Oregon. Maybe you don't even know his name anymore, but he was a really major figure in cognitive psychology, cognitive neuroscience. And I gave a talk about the poverty and brain stuff, after which somebody who was the head of a large, wealthy organization that supported cognitive neuroscience got up and sort of denounced me. It was kind of like, j'accuse, saying that I was saying that poor children are permanently brain damaged. I did not say that. This was stigmatizing. And I mean, I wanted to say, I was talking about understanding how to intervene to help them reach their potentials. Permanent brain damage is crazy. It's just sort of ugly. But yeah, so, and then I felt that the developmentalists, and I don't know if there's any developmental researchers here, I felt that there was, I felt like I didn't have a union card for development. I got these reviews saying, Farah thinks she can sail into developmental research and blah, 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 blah. It's like, please, critique the proposal in terms of like what it says and could do or what errors are in it. this kind of ad hominem thing is horrible. Anyway, so I felt personally hurt because I was being treated like some icky eugenicist. I mean, it wasn't just that one talk. I mean, there were just a lot of things. I had organized a symposium for the AAAS meeting one year. And somebody on, the governing board, whatever, they have like a bunch of academics, philanthropists, etc., who serve on their board, wrote the president, I don't know, saying she got wind of the proposal that I had made, which was about poverty in the brain and interventions and all that kind of stuff. And she thought this was, utterly inappropriate, and the AAAS should not be associated with it. I mean, I just can't tell you how hurtful it was. And, AAAS kind of said, don't worry about it. And I got to put together my symposium and bring it there. But yeah, I felt personally kind of insulted, like I was being treated like a bad person, and professionally thwarted, right? Like I couldn't do my symposium, I couldn't get a grant. The reviews from journals, oh my God. I mean, it was incredible. Like I wish I had saved them actually, because they were so kooky, and in retrospect, I don't know, it might have been instructive for somebody. But they were like, but how do you know that the brains of the poor even work the same way? And it's like, well, this is, maybe one way we can look at this is finding out. And then they said, revealing the racist assumption that poor people are black people, that the brains of African, descendants may well operate differently because of, the different genetics. It's like, so I couldn't publish it. I mean, so I was so outraged. These were such shitty reviews. I sent them to Ron Mangan, who some of you may know. He directs the Cognitive Neuroscience Summer Institute. And he was a journal editor at that point, brain research. I emailed him and I said, this is crazy. I'm going nuts. Can you read this paper and read these reviews and tell me what you think? And he said, I think I'm going to publish your paper. So, and maybe the lesson there is, at root, we're all human beings in this field of science. Science is a human proposition. And people get crazy about things that they think are morally, wrongly conceived, like the crazy reviewers. And I suppose they thought they were doing the right thing. So just kind of saying, okay, look, they're only human. But also, human nature and human relations can have good consequences. Stay friends with the people you meet at conferences and go to grad school with and all that stuff. I just had the sense that Ron was a simpatico guy, and he would realize that this was pretty crazy, and he would want to help me, and it was all true.
I think what that speaks to in general is, I think a lot of times when we get involved in science, we do so because of a draw to something that is rational and concrete and logical and so on, and then you get your first reviews, and the frustration, I think what you're articulating isn't just reviews that disagree with you or something, but
Right.
reviews that seem to be speaking a different language. And it's not, it doesn't have to be morally charged. There's sort of something difficult to navigate there. But I want to actually back up because, again, we skipped sort of a step there, which is the fact that you got to that place in the first place from the comfy seat of your tenured position, you know, with a very successful career behind you. You pivoted to work on something that is less established, is morally more complex, socially more complex. What led you there, and was that challenging to make a switch? I mean, you mentioned sort of not feeling like you're a developmental psychologist and sort of being treated differently. I totally understand the difficulty of wading into a new field. So what has that been like, and what was the impetus for that very significant change, I would say, in research direction?
Yeah. Oh, I mean, I think it's just a temperament thing. I think some people, they know what they want their life's work to be, and they focus on that for their working life, and they often, you know, leave behind a very valuable contribution to the science. You know, other people have shorter attention spans, and I'm one of them. And I will say, one of the wonderful things about academia is that you have the freedom to shift and work on different things. You know, I had a colleague here years ago. He was an animal learning guy, David Williams, and I don't know, at some point, like you know, when he was a faculty member, he decided he was really interested in clinical psychology. And he took clinical training, and he became a member of the clinical faculty. So people, you know, academia is a good way to do that. Lyle Unger, who some of you may know, did Lyle lecture to this group? No. He's a computer science prof. Lyle started out his life in chemical engineering. He got his chemie PhD at MIT, came to Penn as a chemie professor, and then I don't know enough about chemie to explain, you know, exactly the path that he took, but there's a lot of, like, control processes are really important in chemical engineering, which kind of gets you into computer science. So so he started doing a lot of computer science research, and he became a computer science professor. I don't know if that was his choice or computer science said, "We want you," or whatever. But I mean, obviously, if we wanted him, they'd be totally free to say no thanks. And now he's really into both artificial intelligence and psychology. He does, excuse me, some of that scary stuff of, you know, scraping information from the web and, you know, figuring out, you know, correlates of different personality traits as a function of geography and God knows what else, you know, education level, etc. So again, these are all examples of being able to switch what you work on, what you spend your time and energy doing. People do that outside of academia too, but the regular paycheck helps, right? Because you know, when you're gearing up to do something totally new, you may not be the most productive person. So you've got a year, you know, where you're kind of feeling your way along and in a protected environment. Ron DeSantis would probably say, aha, she's saying that the guaranteed money and the protected environment lets you do whatever you want. Yeah, I think there are other fields where you can do that, but I think it's just logistically a little more complicated.
Was it challenging to make that switch over and above, you know, the challenges you articulated before about sort of not being welcomed by a different subfield, like logistically your lab was doing one thing and switched to another thing. Was that challenging, or was that sort of a natural transition?
It didn't seem too challenging, partly because it wasn't like I had to retool to learn the theories and techniques of, socioeconomic status neuroscience, right? It didn't exist. So I did need to, and I knew cognitive neuroscience, and I was reading about SES in sociology books, because until recently there hasn't been too much interest in neuroscience. I suppose there's also a literature in public health, epidemiology and so forth. SES has huge effects on health outcomes through all kinds of interesting pathways, including neuroscience pathways, right? So like low SES is accompanied by more stress. Stress causes inflammation and does bad things to your brain, and all the little cortisol molecules bombarding your hippocampus, kills your neurons and makes them, retract their little dendrites, and so yeah, but yeah, it was. Now I find myself struggling to keep up, actually. I have a Google alert for socioeconomic status, and brain, and, a couple of times a week I get papers. Now, do you guys ever use Google alerts for anything that you're interested in? Do you do that? Yeah, it's very interesting what you find. Okay, so, you get a lot of stuff that isn't relevant at all, because some damn keyword is matched, like brain drain, talks about poverty in the brain, but it's brain drain isn't the kind of brain thing that we're interested in. And a lot of medical stuff, like, outcomes of this kind of tumor as a function of whatever. But, you can skim the titles and figure out which ones you want to read. And it's very, very illuminating. You may or may not find something that like changes the direction of your work, but you will get a feel for what other people are working on. It's kind of like having your finger on the pulse. So I definitely recommend. What is it? Google Alerts? No, what is it called? Google.
Well, you could do Google Alerts, and then separately you can do like Scholar Alerts. Yeah, so Google Scholar has a separate system for that as well, if you want.
I should try that. Yeah.
So you've obviously had a very successful career in a variety of ways, and as you know, there's just a billion different ways to succeed in academia. Every single person on the faculty here has a very different strengths and weaknesses. Do you think there's been any particular strengths that you've played to in your career that has worked for you? And also on the flip side, are there any particular parts of this career that you've always struggled with? Weaknesses that you have?
Question. Well, let me focus on struggle, because I feel like there's so many struggles. But I'm a little disorganized. People have been, my inbox has thousands, tens of thousands of messages, and I realize I'm letting myself off the hook for basically irresponsible behavior when I say, oh, I'm so ADD, I just can't answer all these emails, especially when somebody's emailed me something and they really deserve a response. But I do struggle with that. The flip side is people email. I mean, just people, absolute strangers, email with sometimes crazy, sick questions. Because I work on neuroethics, stuff on brain-machine interfaces, I must get an email or two a month from somebody who thinks they've had a chip implanted in their brain, or there's like some kind of, the government is beaming something at their brain. Those are not difficult, because I just don't respond to those. Those people are living a nightmare. They're very sick, but there's nothing that you can say to them. Actually, my admin a few years ago was sitting in the office, and somebody who I guess had emailed me, and I tried to suggest some, I think maybe she sounded like schizophrenic, but I suggested that she told me where she was, I can't even remember where it was, but I suggested that she might want to, consult the psychiatry department at some, teaching hospital or something. So she called the office, and Nora picked up. And, Nora being a kind person, and, she tried to help this woman see that she really was okay. Nobody was after her. And yeah, it was just so sad. And afterwards, she was like, I can't believe, we talked for an hour, and she just, yeah, it's easy to make jokes about the tinfoil hat people, but really they are living a nightmare. They are just as anguished as you would be if you really did have people trying to implant things in your brain. It's terrible. But most of the weird emails are just, random high school students or college students who don't want to write their own term paper, so they say, could you just, give me a few paragraphs in answer to these questions? I guess maybe ChatGPT will, take care of that now. Yeah, sometimes people with sick kids email me asking my opinion. I always say, I'm not a clinician. But, go, again, academic medical center, talk to a specialist. But I don't know, there are just so many things. Oh, there's a million. I assume you're starting to get these now, and some of the others here will relate. These fly-by-night, I think they're, for-profit, scammy publications saying, Dear Professor Farah Martha J., we are just closing out our fall issue of the International Journal of Whoozee and we would love to, add your paper as the. I actually got one today that said "Dear First Name." So and I don't just kind of trying to, my spam filter has learned to get rid of some of those, but I don't know. I'm complaining about email. It just seems like it's endless, and there's no single category. But after a while, I just, my eyes cross and I can't do it.
It's a surprisingly notable part of the career, just managing the emails. I think I've heard faculty members for years and years talk about their emails, and you kind of don't really believe it until you see it, but it's a challenge. Yeah.
No,
what about the other side of the question is about strengths. If you had to identify unique strengths that have helped you reach this point, what would you say?
Oh God, I don't know. I don't want to.
Well, maybe I'll make it not about
myself.
You.
And, yeah,
are there any specific qualities in graduate students or young scientists that you think are especially valuable or predictive in a scientific
that's
career?
good. That's good. Yeah. Well, I'll start by saying there are definitely different kinds of graduate students who have what it takes. I mean, there's, it takes all kinds, that cliche. So, you definitely have to be smart in some sense that at least loosely overlaps with IQ smart. Probably doesn't exactly overlap with IQ smart, but able to sort of solve problems, basically. And hardworking. You need to, I think, be doing it for the right reason, because if you're trying to get famous or rich, you should definitely find a different field. And then, I think, I love a creative student. And that's often very hard to gauge. I'm actually not taking graduate students now, but when I was, I leaned really heavily on the essays. I wanted to see somebody who had a little flair in the way they thought about things and expressed themselves. And I know that was probably biasing me against people who just didn't have the gift of gab or the written equivalent of it, but at least I kind of had the sense of, oh, there's an interesting mind there. It would be fun to have that person around.
Well, I will now open it up if there's a question or two from the audience. I think we have time for one or two. Yeah.
So, did your studying of philosophy as an undergrad impact you going forward?
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah. Yeah, I think so. First of all, philosophy it does give you an appreciation for certain, it teaches you certain habits of mind. Especially the kind of philosophy that I was studying at MIT. It was all analytic philosophy, so it definitely teaches you to be analytic. And I found in particular, I guess I just took one philosophy of science course, but I found that very interesting. I'm guessing it was pretty standard philosophy of science fare about, the relations between theories and data, and sort of where theories come from, and et cetera. And then the philosophy of mind, which was extremely useful because as a cognitive neuroscientist, in some sense, what you're studying, day in, day out, is the relation between mind and brain, right? Well, that's not simple. In fact, it's kind of obscure, and I don't think human beings will ever figure it out. But certainly, we satisfy ourselves with the correlates, the neural correlates of mental states and mental abilities. But I think it is helpful to kind of understand the different relations those could have. Is some little bit of activity in a certain place in the brain, is that identical to a certain thought or a certain experience? Or is that experience, let us say, implemented by any of a number of sort of functionally equivalent brain systems? So, I don't think there's anything I would ever have done differently in terms of running an experiment or interpreting it because of the philosophy, but I feel like it has given me a firmer grounding in how to think about this stuff. Any philosophy majors here? Yeah?
Well, a minor, but...
Oh, good. Great.
I think we have time for one more question if someone has a burning question.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, thank you first of all. It seems like you were always interested in interested in little things, but you knew that what you were gonna do and where you were going into. But did you ever feel like in college, before college, or after college, that you were lost, or you didn't know what you were gonna do, or you were confused about like your career? Like had that, I guess, fear as a teenager or as a college student?
You know, I feel like, yeah, people really differ on this in their youth. I felt like I was always really excited about at least one thing. So I didn't have that question that I think would be a very kind of disquieting question of like, well, what do I actually want to do? I have a good friend who's actually now a philosophy professor, who agonized in college about what he wanted to do afterwards. And, you know, it was, do I want to be a psychologist, clinical psychologist? Do I want to be a philosopher? Do I want to be a performer? I mean, it turns out he's like a world-class magician. He settled on philosophy, and I think he at last feels good about that. But yeah, I mean, I don't think it's a bad sign to not know what you want to do, and I can understand that it would make you feel a little unmoored, but that was never my problem. But I also think it's kind of normal in one's 20s to do that.
Okay, we'll stop there. Thank you all. Let us thank Dr. Farah one last time.
Oh, thank you.